Have you ever been just about to fall asleep when your mind suddenly replays a conversation from years ago? A slightly delayed response, a look you couldn't quite read, and even though that moment has long passed, your chest still tightens as if it only happened last night. Most of us assume it's just overthinking, that we're too sensitive, or maybe a bit of a perfectionist. But what if that replay isn't simply remembering? What if it's a quiet attempt to edit the image we hold of ourselves? Psychology calls this rumination, a repetitive loop of thought that doesn't actually lead to real change. Unlike reflection, which helps you learn and move forward, rumination is like pressing rewind over and over again, hoping that this time you'll appear more perfect. So why can such a small moment carry so much weight? And what does it reveal about the way you see yourself? If you've ever felt this, comment 1 so we can explore it more deeply together. But there's an important detail many people overlook. When you replay a conversation, you're not just remembering it, you're rewriting it. Memory doesn't function like a perfectly stored video file. It's more like a story that gets edited each time it's told. And every time you return to that moment, your current emotions slip in, magnifying what you believe were mistakes and blurring the parts you actually handled well. You start imagining sharper replies, more confident expressions, a version of yourself who seems more worthy of respect. It sounds harmless, but over time it sends a quiet message. Who you were in that moment wasn't good enough. And when that loop repeats long enough, it stops being a lesson. It turns into a courtroom in your mind, where you are both the defendant and the judge, and the trial never truly ends. And when that inner trial goes on for too long, something subtle begins to shift. You're no longer replaying to understand, you're replaying to convict. At first, you tell yourself you're just learning from the experience. But if it were truly about learning, the loop would have stopped once the lesson was clear. Instead, it keeps spinning. The same scene, the same sentence, the same sting of embarrassment. Psychology draws a clear line between reflection and rumination. Reflection moves forward. It asks, what can I do differently next time? Rumination stays stuck. It asks, why am I like this? And that second question is more dangerous than it sounds, because it doesn't target your behavior, it targets who you are. When "what did I do wrong" slowly turns into "what's wrong with me," your self-esteem begins to erode, not loudly, but persistently. And when your self-esteem is worn down in that quiet way, you begin to live more cautiously. Not because you're weak, but because you're trying to avoid another trial in the future. You weigh every sentence before you speak. You analyze other people's facial expressions after each interaction. You reread messages you've already sent, not to communicate better, but to make sure you don't commit another offense. It may look like responsibility, like maturity, but if that carefulness is rooted in the fear of being judged, it's no longer growth, it's self-protection. Many studies on social anxiety show that people who tend to ruminate often judge themselves more harshly than reality warrants and overestimate how much others notice their mistakes. While most people have long forgotten the moment, you're still holding on to it as evidence against yourself. And the important question is this: what made your brain believe it needs to do that? The answer usually isn't in that conversation. It lies in how you learned about your worth very early on. If you grew up in an environment where acceptance came with conditions, where making a mistake meant criticism or cold silence, your brain learned a very clear rule. Safety comes from not being wrong. And to avoid being wrong, you must constantly check yourself. In that context, replaying isn't just a random habit. It's an old survival strategy. Your mind returns to the moment, searching for a more perfect version, as if doing it well enough would mean being kept, being approved of, being loved. But here's the problem. You're no longer in that environment. And the strategy that once helped you survive is now keeping you trapped in a loop that never truly ends. And here's the paradox. Your brain isn't trying to make you suffer. It's trying to protect you in the only way it once knew how. But when the circumstances have changed and the strategy hasn't, that protection turns into a burden. You're no longer the child who had to anticipate an adult's reaction. You're no longer in an environment where a small mistake could cost you connection. And yet your nervous system still reacts as if the threat is present. Research on anxiety and memory shows that the brain tends to prioritize storing and reactivating negatively charged experiences because they were once linked to survival. That helps explain why you can easily recall one awkward sentence, but struggle to remember the hundreds of moments you handled well. So the question is no longer, why do I keep overthinking? A more accurate question might be, how did this strategy once help me survive? And when you begin to ask the question in that way, a subtle shift starts to happen. You no longer see yourself as someone who is broken. You begin to see yourself as someone who once had to adapt. The difference may sound small, but its impact is profound. Instead of asking, why do I always ruin things? You might try asking, how did I learn to protect myself? When the perspective changes, the courtroom in your mind slowly loses its absolute authority. Psychology calls this self-compassion, the ability to treat yourself with the same understanding you would offer someone else. Research shows that people who practice self-compassion tend to ruminate less and recover more quickly after mistakes, not because they're more perfect, but because they don't turn one awkward moment into a life sentence. And perhaps this is where the loop can finally begin to slow down. And when the loop begins to slow down, you may notice something simple that has long been overlooked. Not every memory needs to be corrected. Some moments are simply you learning how to exist in this world. Awkward, imperfect, but real. When you stop trying to edit the past to protect your image, you create a small space. And that space isn't for self-criticism, it's for breathing. Research on emotional regulation shows that when we allow an experience instead of resisting it, the intensity of negative emotions tends to decrease over time. This doesn't happen because the memory disappears, but because you stop feeding it with more energy. So perhaps the first step isn't to eliminate every replay. It's to stop automatically pressing rewind each time your mind suggests it. So perhaps this story was never only about an old conversation. It's about the relationship between you and yourself. Each time you press rewind, you're trying to prove that you could have done better. But your worth was never dependent on delivering the perfect sentence or reading someone's expression flawlessly. A person is not defined by one awkward moment. We are defined by our ability to learn, adjust, and keep moving forward. When you shift from self-judgment to self-understanding, what changes isn't just the way you see the past. It changes how you enter new conversations. Lighter, less defensive, less afraid of getting it wrong. And if you've recognized yourself in those quiet mental loops, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes naming your experience is the first step towards stepping out of it.